Are we on? I think we are on. Welcome. My name is Bob Madison, and I'm here representing at the moment the Huntington Beach Public Library Literacy Volunteers. We have a very, very special guest, Susan Straight, author of new memoir, In the Country of Women, available at your library, and more importantly, available at bookstores everywhere, particularly Lido Books, actually has a whole bunch of them now. And I would like to share with our listeners that when I went to get this out of our own branch, we had 5 of them and I had to wait a week before I can get it. So when I'm returning mine tomorrow, it'll be available. Susan, if you don't mind, before we start, I just want to say a few words about the literacy volunteers. And for that, I will go to our mission statement. The mission statement of the Literacy Volunteers of Huntington Valley is a mission and commitment to establish literacy as a fundamental skill possessed by each and every member of our community. To this end, we will recruit and train volunteers to tutor adults one-on-one in basic reading skills, recruit adult learners, and match each with a trained tutor, maintain a teaching material library for the use of tutors, and offer support services to tutors and adult learners. And Susan, one other thing which I think will interest you is that a lot of our learners prior to this call had taken up your new book, In the Country of Women. And I have some handwritten notes from some of them. And if you just give me a moment, I'd like to share some of them with you because I think they're fascinating. One of them is from one of our adult learners named Maribeth, who is actually on the call, I believe. And what really struck me was this idea of keeping personal history was born when she started reading the book In the Country of Women. Susan Straight, she is absolutely right. We need to tell the life of our ancestors, to let our children know it, their traditions, achievements, and also their defeats. They know resilience, and they had to face everything without having anything or resources. That's from Maribeth. And I'm just going to share 1 or 2 other reader comments. This is from Rosa, who's also one of our learners. Since I've been in this program, I feel more secure in my self-esteem and my confidence is much better. My whole life has changed positively. And Rosie said, since I discovered the literacy program, I started to study English and my life has changed. Now I can read with my children and also have good communication with my children's teachers, my family doctor, and other English-speaking people. That's from Rosie. So I think because this book is so important in terms of, your experiences as a reader, and one of the things that struck me the most is that you're a great reader and you talk about that in the book. It's great for our learners to spend this time with Susan Straight, author of several novels, and her new memoir, In the Country of Women. Susan, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's lovely to hear you say those things because my mom is 86 now, my little immigrant Swiss mom, and we drove around yesterday for several hours. Every other day I go pick her up, and she talks about how hard her life was because her mom died when she was so young, but also because when she got here, she couldn't speak English. And learning to speak English from Vin Scully doing Dodger broadcasts is kind of a legend among Southern Californians. But to hear Rosa say that, my grandmother's name, as you know from the book, is Rosa. And to be able to speak English and to be able to read and write, where else can people often learn that if they're adults when they arrive here, but literacy volunteers and the library? And I will be honest with you and say I have many people in my family who cannot read or write still and dropped out of high school. We all went to high school together, but there were a lot of men that I grew up with dropped out of high school. And that's been a great stumbling block for them. So I'm so thrilled to be here for this program.
Thank you so much. We were thinking that before we dived into a lot of questions, and I have a lot of my own, and we also have many from people who are tuning into the broadcast here, but maybe we could start with you reading something from the book, if that's okay.
I think that'd be fun. And I was thinking about this weekend because it finally got cooler today. Here in Riverside, it's 87, which it hasn't been in the 80s for 8.5 weeks. And I was out in the yard yesterday, and I was missing my brother who passed away in 2002. And the tree that he planted is part of this little scene. And also there were some fig beetles. I'm sure our viewers know those bright green iridescent big fig beetles. Those were a huge part of my kids' lives, and they were on the porch yesterday. So I thought I'd read you this little part from called A Dew Point, a Pack of Four. When it was so hot in the summer that the fig beetles died flying in the air, falling onto the grass beside us, shining iridescent green as tiny Christmas ornaments, my girls held that beauty in their small palms. It was so hot, butterflies landed on our arms for sweat. Yellow finches flew with their beaks open, panting, and golden baby lizards slipped under the screen door to sleep in shoes deep inside our closets. My old house still had no air conditioning back then, and it would be 108, 109, 112 for days in August. I had 3 small daughters sleeping in one stifling bedroom near those fig trees, and the beetles would crash into the window screens like drunken bombers. The girls would troop into my bedroom. I put 2 sheets outside on the grass around 11 p.m., and we lay in the yard, staring at the sky, the impossible night blue. My first years at this house, I had planted a seed packet of Italian sunflowers, all colors from white to lemon yellow to buttery gold to deepest red. Now the sunflowers had all hybridized, and they came up from new seeds every year, growing to 20 feet tall around the fences. At night, the yellow finches that hung upside down on the seed heads were still so hot that their sad chirps fell like mournful commas all around us where we lay on the sheets. We talked about the night blue, all the different blues in the art and nature books we had read, the paintings they had seen at museums, and the varying skies. Humans love blue. Winter sky faded pale, summer electric turquoise, Pacific Ocean, blue as new denim. So then we talked about Nîmes, France, where the material for Levi's was first made. Lapis lazuli on a street vendor's necklace, and the lakes in Switzerland, land of their grandmother, as vivid as Windex.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much. Again, Susan Straight, author of In the Country of Women. So listening to that, there is, and you can speak to this certainly much better than I, there is a strain of American lyricism from Sherwood Anderson through Ray Bradbury. It's a sort of lilting poetic quality to the prose that you have there, just perfect. What authors' voices, inspired you to read? Because I see from your memoir you were reading when you were 3. So who are the great, inspirations to you?
It's really a fascinating thing for you to ask me this today, because I'm finishing a giant project that I haven't released yet at all. And it's a new Library of America, 909 books of the American experience. And I'm doing this with the geomapping company, Esri. So we go into deep geographic locations. So what's funny is that this morning I was working on the essays that accompany each region. And of course, when it's out, I'll send you the link and you can share it with all your readers. But the book that made me into a writer, I found all at the Riverside Central Library, because as you see in the memoir, my mom could not afford to buy me books. It was quite the legend that she spent her last quarter on that little golden book, Tawny Scrawny Lion, which I still have. And I have to say, back here, if you look in this cabinet, there's Heidi, there's Patty Woodlawn, there are all these great books. So this morning, just sitting right here, I was thinking that some of the writers whose lyricism really changed me were Sula, Toni Morrison's Sula, where she describes a woman snapping green beans and her fingers moved as if she was playing a complicated instrument. I will never, ever see my middle daughter, who has very long, beautiful fingers. And she knows this because she always laughs at me when we're snapping green beans at the sink. Toni Morrison comes into my head. Sherwood Anderson is somebody I wrote about this morning, Bob. I can't believe you brought it up, because that beautiful intersection between the cornfields, the wildness of the fields and the trees, and then the brick buildings, that's such an American intersection right there. And so that's what I was writing about this morning, was some writers of the Midwest. And here, somebody I'd love to bring up for our listeners today, one of my favorite writers of all time in California is Helena Maria Viramontes, who actually was born in East LA, went to college at UC Irvine, and writes about buttonwillow. Her mother was a migrant farm worker in Buttonwillow, California, off the 5. And the lyricism in Helena Maria Viramontes' book called Under the Feet of Jesus is a classic. And I would recommend that highly. There's a line in there, because I teach these 2 books that we just mentioned every year. There were wasps and their legs dangled like golden threads from the peach trees. You're so kind to bring it up, because you never forget when you read something that's that beautiful and lyrical.
So before we actually start talking about your new memoir, let's backtrack a little and tell us a little bit about your journey from being obviously a very precocious reader to being a very talented writer.
I am a big subscriber, because my mom was so much an immigrant who felt that if we didn't work hard, like all peril would happen. And you and I were talking about this a little bit before we started. I'm 60 years old, and we are of the generation whose parents grew up sometimes with great poverty, and then their parents had experienced more poverty than they did. So it never escaped me when I was little, since I was the oldest of 5 kids. And as you know from the memoir, my mom always had foster kids. I have a full brother and a half brother. But the whole notion of chores, we had so many chores to do. I learned to vacuum and iron and cook when I was like 6 years old. But always in the back of my mind, I would see these images, and I think that's what makes you a writer. I'm a big believer in that we are sort of genetically engineered sometimes to be who we are. I mean, I was watching the Dodgers today. My mom and I were watching the Dodgers yesterday. And when you think about what it takes to be a great pitcher, my mom still loves to talk about the great pitchers that she watched when she was learning to speak English, like that arm throw and that muscle memory. My muscle memory is brain memory, and it's always for that kind of storytelling. But I will say something that most writers don't bring up. I believe this is true, because my students always say this. You have to be a good listener. You have to be a great listener to be a good writer. And I am such a good listener. On my porch is where a lot of this memoir takes place. Every single day, someone tells me the story of his or her life, no matter where I am. Every year I drive across the country with my dog, now that my kids are grown, and I'll be in Walcott, Iowa, and I'll be at like a truck stop, and somebody will tell me the story of her life, and in detail, over eggs and toast, and I will listen. So I think that there's a way that we collect narratives when we're truly writers, and then there's a way that we process it in the same way that someone who's a genius coder, like my son-in-law works for Google, he's a genius coder, born in Nigeria. How does his brain know how to take all those characters on the computer? And he works for YouTube. My daughters and I find this inexplicable. Like, I'll bring him food and I look at the 2 big screens in the back of the house where he's working, and I can't even look at them. They're too scary. So some of it I think I was genetically gifted with. I do.
Yeah, I'm with you. I can count up to 5. But that after that, I'm on my own. It's very interesting you mentioned that, because when you said that, I had this recollection. I was reading Stephen King's memoir a few years ago on writing, and he said that he was a quiet and solitary child who spent a lot of time with adults. Mm-hmm. And he said when that happened to you, you spent a lot of time in your early youth in interesting and sort of quirky psychological territory that you normally wouldn't be in if all of your friends were your own age. Would you think that was a commonality with most writers?
I think that that somebody like Stephen King, who I admire greatly, by the way, I just finished reading two Stephen King novels last week that someone left on the porch. One was The Outsiders, which was terrifying. And then I read Elevation, this beautiful, slim Stephen King novel that I would highly recommend. But I think that's one thing. Like Elena Maria Viramontes is a friend of mine now, and she talks about like growing up and her mom would hand make tortillas for breakfast. They didn't have much food. And then talking about nopales, the cactus that she would slice, and that she could make a meal out of a very small piece of chicken. But see, it takes someone like Elena or Stephen to think about what that means in a detail and then be able to translate it to a scene. So I think those of us who are writers always are working with that in our minds. And those of us who are visual artists, for example, or someone who's a dancer takes that and translates it to movement. They see movement in everything, what the dog does or what a child does. So I really think our brains are hardwired, those of us who are writers, to take in narrative and then translate it into a scene or a story. I will say to you that I was never alone. I was never, ever alone. And I crack up because I was the oldest of 5 kids in one house. And then when my father remarried, I was the youngest of 5 kids. I grew up in a very crowded neighborhood in a huge, high school. I got married really young. I was never alone until my children left. And then they came back during pandemic. And so I've been alone for 2 weeks now. And it's a very strange feeling because I would like to say this to our viewers. You can write anywhere. I keep this here to show you. Here's my new book. This is from Staples. These are the 99-cent Staples. Here's my new book. And when people say, oh, to be a writer, you have to go to a writer's colony, or you have to get an MFA, or you have to go to college. I was lucky enough to go to college and study with James Baldwin. But I came home at 23 years old, and I've been here ever since. I've been working. I've worked 33 years at UCR. It's never stopped me from writing, because maybe Stephen King would say this, but writing is our way of being alone. Even if we are in a huge space, that our brains are working and we are alone in that space.
So that brings two things to mind. If you don't mind my asking, do you write all of your books first draft in longhand?
Well, most of what I write, yes. I have really bad eyes. Also, when I was younger, my mom gave me the Smith Corona little blue typewriter that I'm sure many of our viewers remember. I graduated from high school in 1978, and my mom wanted me to be a secretary, as you know, from the memoir. But I typed on that typewriter until the year, I don't remember what, and then I got an IBM Selectric. I didn't write my first novel on a computer until Highwire Moon, and that was the year 2000.
Wow.
Yeah, everything was written by hand and then on a typewriter. It still works better for me. Things come to me. This is a scene that I've been working on that's set in Santa Ana and Anaheim during COVID. So I have Post-its. I have I have 3 kinds of notebooks. Always I have the little notebooks from the 99-cent store that I carry in my purse. I'll write in the car. One of my most famous essays is about writing in my Mercury Villager when I was a single mom and my 3 kids were little. I was writing last night at the Spectrum waiting room while I was turning in equipment. Oh yeah, I had to turn equipment in for my youngest daughter, and it was a 45-minute wait. So I got my notebook out and I was working on scenes from my next book. So I like to write by hand. I do.
Okay. I just wanted to ask one quick question before we do a deep dive into In the Country of Women. Again, available at the library or at bookstores everywhere. We were talking about the hardship of our parents a few minutes ago. And before we talk at length about what the book is about, I just wanted to say that while I was appalled at the hardship so many people in your family had faced going back generations, this is never a dark book. So no. I mean, awful things happen to good people, but it is ultimately a hopeful and a bright memoir. And I just wanted to ask, is this your default, or is your default position you're more a Pollyanna than a Cassandra, or is this you think things are too dark in our culture?
I don't think I'm a Pollyanna or a Cassandra, because I think that those are two like diametrically opposed things. But I'll tell you a little story. Last night I was really tired. I had been working on my new novel, and my youngest daughter Rosette, she's working on that show called Below Deck. It's a Bravo series, and she was in Spain for 6 weeks filming, and now she's editing. And she called me. We took our walk together. She lives in Pasadena now. So the dog and I were walking, and Rosette was walking, and we talked for an hour on the phone. And everywhere I was walking, she walked with me during her childhood and during pandemic. And so she knew where I was. And what she said is that her generation, she just turned 26 3 weeks ago, that everything is, people embrace darkness. And she said she finds this quite fascinating because on TikTok, some of the new most popular people are about, here I am living my ordinary life. Even if I had trauma, or even if I am a single mom, I can find joy in the everyday. And so we had this long discussion, Bob, just about that. And I said, but why do you think you feel that way? That you like this other trend? And she said, I think it's because my grandmothers had such hard lives that I never felt like, I wasn't the most lucky person in the world. She said, Grandma Alberta died before I was born, but I knew about her life because you told me. And she said, I watched Grandma Gail, her habits from having been so poor. And she said, you were the interstitial person. Like, I grew up not in poverty, but I grew up, we made hot dog casserole, like I had to feed I had to feed 7 people actually, and we had 1 package of hot dogs, and I learned how to make that. So I think it's really interesting that you asked that. I never stopped to examine those things. I believe that I take in all the stories that all these people around me told. Men, women, people. I have no idea why I have that face. I do have that face though. But it's also because I say to them, well, how did you feel when he left? And then they'll tell me. And tonight I'm going to someone's birthday. My 2 friends survived the Las Vegas massacre.
Oh, good God, yes.
Yes. And see, America has completely forgotten that. And I'm going to see my 2 friends. They're both, one's a former police dispatcher, and one was married to a police officer who died. And they were at Las Vegas, and they shielded each other. And when everything was done, they were covered with blood from the people who had died around them. So this is a terribly dark story, is it not? And yet we will be together tonight playing darts, at the Elks Lodge. And it's the way when they tell the story and then someone listens to the story, your burden is lightened. That's what it means to be a human, is that when you tell the story, it's not that you are Cassandra or Pollyanna, you're just the sharer of the narrative.
It's very, 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 very insightful. Can you tell our listeners, for those who haven't read it, a little bit about the book? Because here we are talking about it as if everyone knows, and some people may be coming to this fresh. So what can you tell us about In the Country of Women?
Well, I just want to say this has been such a lovely conversation so far, because no one usually asks me questions at that level. I think it's because we're close to the same age, you and me, and we both like to think about what narrative works on. So it's funny, I've not really ever mentioned my 2 friends that I'm going to see tonight. And actually, Diane, one of them, was born in Rubidoux. And so that's what's funny, is if you're from Orange County or Riverside County or San Bernardino County or LA or wherever you're watching from, Rubidoux is one of those tiny little places, that nobody knows about. And so Diane loves to tell me stories because I'm from, I lived in Rubidoux until I was 3. The book is, the interesting thing is behind me, this photo right here. This was the first time, and this is my 10th book, that I was ever able to ask. I asked for this to be the frontispiece, because this photo is my mother-in-law, Alberta. And look at her, she looks like a member of the Supremes, she's just beautiful. And that's her sister, Rosie, who's with her. And my friend Douglas McCullough blew that photograph up and restored it. The real photo would fit in my hand like this. It's
Really?
this little triangular torn Polaroid, and my father-in-law saved it for years. It was in a baggie, a sandwich baggie, with a piece of cardboard. And so when I went to rescue a bunch of family photos after my sister-in-law had a roof leak and the roof was falling in, and so I went and got this crate, and it was filled with family photos. This was the thing that really inspired me to start writing this book, is that I saw this photo and I missed my mother-in-law and I missed her storytelling. And also I knew that Rosette, my youngest daughter, who's such a great storyteller in her own way, had never been able to meet her grandmother in person. So I sort of started putting it together, and then the cover is also behind me. And that is my daughters who were at this wedding. And then the last little thing is that's James Baldwin there. And a lot of what I was saying in the beginning of this book is that I was really helped along. I got a full scholarship to USC. You know, I was not encouraged to go to college, but I went, and I got a full ride to USC, and I met TC Boyle, Tom Boyle, who encouraged me to go to graduate school. And I was going to go try to be a sports writer. I had covered one Dodger game, and my mom wanted me to meet Vin Scully so I could tell Vin Scully that she loved him. And I did tell him that, and he said, "That's great, but I'm already married." And so I had accomplished what I had set out to go to USC to do. But this book, this memoir, was sort of percolating all while I was writing fiction. And it was because I would like to say to our listeners and our viewers, because when an older person dies, to have the stories die with that person, I think is the hugest tragedy that happens to humans. Because really all we have through all these generations, it doesn't matter if your family goes upwardly mobile or downwardly mobile, none of it matters if you don't keep your family stories alive. So I love that the two people who wrote letters that you read at the beginning say that, is that I've received hundreds of emails and letters since this book came out with people saying, "I'm going to listen to my grandmother when she talks now." Or when my uncle starts telling a long story at Thanksgiving, rather than rolling my eyes and leaving the table, and this was from somebody who was in their 20s, I'm going to listen. And when my tia starts to talk about, you know, how hard it was when they lived in Guanajuato, rather than me rolling my eyes and thinking I live in Anaheim, I'm going to listen to my tia. So all of these things came into my mind, and I'd been writing little scraps of story down. But what I thought your listeners might like to know is something that you and I mentioned earlier. It's difficult to write your family history. You have to have a scaffolding, right? So the scaffolding I came up with was the idea that women's stories are the ones that don't get told, that we are often given books by famous men. And even though I love Ken Burns, you know, I'm sure lots of us love Ken Burns. The percentage of women that show up in Ken Burns documentaries is pretty small. And I always thought that the great storytellers in our family were the women, and I wanted to honor that.
It's very funny that you say that, because while I loved the whole book, the part that resonated the most for me, which is probably something terrible to say to a writer, but the prologue was just so stunning and so riveting, which you call Homerica, where you talk about history and women's place in our personal histories, and also how women are represented in history. I mean, you know, the Odyssey is not about women, and the Iliad is not about women, and Conrad is not about women, and Churchill was not writing about women, and not only that, these family stories, you know, are what made us what we are and who we are, and it's not dead or ancient history. What happened to your grandmother has a real impact on what happened to you as a woman, or as a grandson, for that matter. So I just, can you tell us how the prologue and the premise is really the spine of the book, because these are so many disparate stories of such different people from such different backgrounds, that had different outcomes. So, you know, what was your overarching principle? I mean, how were you rescuing history here?
that's like whenever because I have, before COVID, I got to travel to a lot of places. I got to go to Mexico City. I've talked about this book in Turkey, in Italy. The thing that, like, the women who I spoke to in Turkey were fascinating. And that was one of the most amazing places I'd ever been. I spoke in 3 different cities. I spoke at 15 different venues for the US State Department in Turkey. And what we talked about was this hidden history of women in Turkey, where here are all these women who got married at 14 and had 11 kids, and their daughters and granddaughters had come to hear me talk. And they said, it was the women in our family that held everything together. While the men went off to war, or while the men, descended into violence. And that same story was told to me in Sicily, and those same stories were told to me in Mexico City. And so when I was working on the book, I told them what I kept thinking was all the books that we're given when we're young women, Homer, like I said, the Odyssey, they're great books, but someone had my favorite line. Everyone writes their favorite line. And one of mine is, Odysseus lost everybody off his boat. People were getting killed. I'm like, women wouldn't lose everybody off their boat. Women would be like, oh no, monster, you're coming after my children. I'm going to kill you now. Women would be like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to replicate my children and just have more. So if like Scylla comes down and tries to take like 3 guys, if those are my kids, I'm not okay with that. I'm going to kill Scylla. And I think that came from my mom's sort of ferocious like way of raising us, but also the stories of Aunt Jenny, who was raped and killed her attacker, and who never had her own children and raised everybody else's children in South Central Los Angeles. To think about Aunt Jenny's sort of odyssey is to think about also like my grandmother from Switzerland, my step grandmother, this odyssey that she made to become head nurse at Kaiser, in Fontana. And just these women were magnificent. And I heard their stories at dinner tables or in porches or in truck beds. And that's what I really felt like, that I was trying to equate the odysseys of Homer with the odysseys of all these women that crossed thousands of miles so that I could be born in Riverside. And I was intentionally saying that my ex-husband, who came by yesterday to help me, we were moving furniture for a daughter, and we're taking our youngest daughter to the Long Beach Grand Prix next Sunday. We're still best friends after all these years. We always talk about the heroic stories that we heard growing up from his grandmother and my grandmother, and that those were our tasks to pass on to our daughters. So the spine of the book ended up being these migrations by women to get to, here we are in Southern California, right? This is supposed to be the promised land. And I think for those women, it really was the promised land. They didn't want to leave. They're buried here. And that meant a lot to me to tell their stories.
So clearly you've been absorbing these stories since your girlhood, but when you started to put together In the Country of Women, I mean, what was your mechanism for gathering the stories? And even more interesting, what did your daughters think of this? They're like, Mom.
They didn't care at all. They don't care about anything I do. So it's as if I work, at an Amazon warehouse or I'm an elementary school teacher. I mean, no one ever asks me anything about what I'm doing. It's just not a thing. And that is very particular to our families. It's funny because we joke, my middle daughter just moved to Harlem. She's working for the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. She just left 2 weeks ago. She lives in New York now. So she said, it's official. I'm texting you. I'm about to get on the subway. I'll call you later. And I was like, what? That's not a thing.
Where in Harlem?
Pardon me?
Where in Harlem does she live?
She lives on 113th Street in Harlem. And the reason I think this is so funny to tell you all is that we had our family picnic. Sim's family picnic was August 6th. And she and her husband drove down from Oakland. They hadn't moved yet. They drove down from Berkeley, the Berkeley area, to come to Fairmount Park in Riverside. And there were 150 of us. And everyone said, we can't believe you're going to Harlem. And Terry Andrews, who is the locus for all the stories about Aunt Jenny and Fine. Terry is featured at the end of the book. Her picture is toward the end. You can find her here. Terry is really, she's my ex-husband's cousin, but she and I are like this. We see each other all the time. She lives 4 blocks from here. She said, "I can't believe you're moving to Harlem. I've read about Harlem in every novel, and I can't wait till you send me a picture of your fire escape." And it just meant so much to me, because you would look at Terry and I, when we go out, she goes out as Pam Grier and I'm Farrah Fawcett, and that's our joke. Terry was raised in South Central LA, and we both grew up reading A Tree Grows in Brooklyn and James Baldwin. So this notion of like what Brooklyn is and what Harlem is came to us through literature. So what I meant to say is, my daughters are very much my daughters. I do not, sit at the dinner table and talk about what I'm doing, because they don't care, not at all. And that's partly because they're a group of 3. So the oldest one, Gayla, lives in Austin, Texas, and she just finished working for the Smithsonian on a food project. So all of these things, they're kind of amazing, the girls, and in a way they've superseded me. Even though I am a best-selling author, I still live here, and I still hang out here, like at the Elks Lodge and on the East Side and at Fairmount Park. And they do not live here anymore. So I think they treasure coming home and hearing this, knowing that I will have collected more stories for them. But yeah, I think growing up for them among storytellers like Alberta and storytellers like Terry, that really meant that narrative meant a lot to them as well.
Yeah. I grew up, I didn't grow up. I lived in Harlem for 8 years on 126.
Wow.
So only 13 blocks from your daughter. So you really didn't start gathering the stories for this. You've been gathering the stories all your life.
It's a great question that I like being able to say right now, because I think many of the people watching us might want to write. And writing your family story is the most intimidating thing to work on. As everyone knows, nonfiction is much harder than fiction. If I'm writing fiction, James Baldwin critiqued my 2 first short stories, I'll never forget. And he said secondary characters are the most important. And that I mentioned this in the memoir. When you're writing fiction, though, you can change it. The person can live or the person can die. And you can make up a beautiful lyrical passage. When you're writing the truth about your aunt from Guanajuato, or your uncle, who is 4th generation, Andalino, or for example, in my new book, I have a character who is raised in the Santa Ana Canyon, and is a descendant of like the pioneer people who first, had ranchos in Santa Ana. In fiction, that's easy. But when readers or listeners to us today are writing nonfiction, the most important part is to get the accuracy down, because someone might come up to you and say, that's not true. Aunt Jenny didn't have like this. She had this. So I will say that Ancestry was a huge help. I went on Ancestry.com for 3 years. And it was fascinating that everyone was asking me in the family, but wait a minute, did you find out what really happened to Minerva? And that was one of the family stories, is that General Sims, my father-in-law, his father, General Sims the First, was a terribly violent man. And that's because his father had been murdered by his wife. And so I found all these documents on Ancestry that kind of support that theory. And so I shared them with, the uncles and aunts who were left. And this was a fascinating conversation. Ancestry, I will say, is a great tool. But here's one thing that's neat. If you're very poor, it's much more difficult to find your ancestry, isn't it? Because you might have moved around a lot. And if you're a woman, it's 1,000 times this. Or someone doesn't listen to you when you enumerate like how many people are in your household. So for example, for Fine, who I consider the heroine of this book, Fine's mother was born enslaved we thought, outside of Nashville, but it turns out it took me 3 years. That's the very end of the memoir. It took me 3 years to find out where Fine was actually born. And I had to go through so many permutations of names to find Catherine. I knew that Fine's mother, who had been born enslaved, was named Catherine. But think about how many ways you can spell Catherine. It was spelled so many different ways, Bob. It took me so long to find it. And when I found it, I was just stunned when I found the US Census from 1870. And I found who we believe is Fine as a one-year-old. Yeah, I got up. Actually, this part I was working on when my kids still lived here. And I just wandered around the hallways and I went and looked at them. They were teenagers. And I just thought, you are the descendants of this woman. And so that is something that takes forever and you have to be really careful. But I wanted to give our viewers a hint, especially if you're looking for women, especially if you're looking for women of color, women who have come from slavery, women who were immigrants, like so many of us. The best thing to look at is not necessarily the census documents, but sometimes the voting directories. You know, it's astonishing. I was able to find things about Aunt Jenny from where she lived during voting directories, which are highly available. City directories are great. You can see where someone lived, if they lived in a back house, if it was a rental. Even it tells people's occupations, like someone's a teacher or a cook or a laborer. So city directories were really helpful. Military records are very helpful. And then also, as I said, voting registries, in addition to census documents. I found the truth about a lot of our relatives from looking at city directories. So that was great.
You had mentioned this conversation a couple of times, and also here in the Country of Women, your mentor and great friend, James Baldwin. So did you know at the time, and if this is too intrusive a question, tell me to go soak my head, but did you know at the time that Baldwin was gay? And at that period, that was a fairly transgressive thing. And your marriage, I guess, would be at that time a fairly transgressive thing. Was there that intersection between, well, we have at this moment transgressive marriage and you're a gay man? What does that mean?
No one's ever asked me that. You know, everyone asks me about James Baldwin. Everyone asked me about James Baldwin because there are these great scenes in the book where, yeah, he was our friend. Like he loved to come over and eat dinner with us. Dwayne, he was personal friends with Dwayne and me, but no one ever asked me that question, ever. And what's fascinating is our marriage was not transgressive here, Bob, not in any way, shape, or form. That was one of my favorite things in this memoir, was to write the section called Costas, because everyone I grew up with was mixed race. You know, right now, if I go out on the sidewalk, my friend Virgie Saucedo married this guy named Glenn Burrows, who's white. He's a Green Bay Packer fan. Virgie's one of 10 kids, third generation Mexican American. Her brother Dennis married someone who's African American. It's just like, that's how my neighborhood is. My next door neighbor, Mario, his wife Nancy's first husband was from Sierra Leone. He has 3 teenagers. Now they're having a baby. Like everything is mixed. But when Dwayne and I got to Amherst, we experienced racism like we had never, ever experienced before. Absolutely. Boston was terrifying. We could not go there.
But not here in California.
No. I mean, we experienced things that were in the novel, in the memoir, like, you know, we did get pulled over by police, of course, that. But in our community, everyone was intermarried. But being in Massachusetts was totally different. And so the interesting thing is, you're the first person who's ever sort of linked that. James Baldwin, and I had already been there for a year, you know, by myself, and then got married. And then when I came back, there was we found out James Baldwin was going to be a visiting professor. Dwayne's family was like, oh my gosh, he's gay, you know, like that's crazy. Like there were lots of people who were stunned that a gay Black man would be a highly esteemed visiting professor at University of Massachusetts Amherst. I think it was a very, very uncomfortable place for him sometimes.
Really?
And, oh yeah, because people either treat you as if you're this famous writer who just got here from France, or people have no idea who you are. And Amherst and Boston were very difficult places for us. There is a section in this memoir, as you know, that like we couldn't even go to the bar where James Baldwin held workshop because we weren't let in. And Dwayne worked as a correctional officer. He worked graveyard shift as a correctional officer, and it was really hard for us. And I wrote on my little Smith Corona on a milk crate on the floor. You know, we found our furniture outside. Our kids still love hearing that story. They're like, you literally found your mattress outside. We're like, well, we had to find 2 or 3 before we got one that was even acceptable. And they're just like, what is happening? But I will say this, it was transformative for both of us because Dwayne read Go Tell It on the Mountain, and I had read Go Tell It on the Mountain. And to sort of see the way that this man had translated his childhood and the terrible atrocities that had happened to his ancestors, to see that sort of brought up in a novel was fascinating. Dwayne and I had this awful little, you know, studio apartment, and I brought him 4 or 5 books I remember that he was just obsessed with. He actually brought them up to me when we were driving last week. We were going to pick up furniture for one of our daughters, and we read this book called Famous All Over Town by this guy named Danny Santiago that turned out to not be Danny Santiago, but an older white guy. And Dwayne said, I still remember parts of that book, and I still remember parts of Go Tell It on the Mountain. And it was just fascinating, like the books that I got from the library at UMass. And I would bring home, and he would take some of them at night to his correctional officer job. So I think we formed a bond because of narrative. And I don't know about transgression, but because we knew that narrative was the only thing that would save us, it was a wonderful bond.
Yeah, he sounds like it was a fascinating relationship that the two of you had.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard this word in my head that he said many times, and writing about it in the memoir, is that he didn't laugh at me for writing about this place, you know, or writing about like my brother-in-law Snooter or my brother-in-law Nacho, or he didn't laugh at any of that. He said, it is imperative that you write about this place. And that word imperative was something that was not anything anyone would say to me ever again. But he said it, and it was actually imperative that I write about this place. And I mean, it's funny because I sort of told you that I haven't even mentioned my new novel, Mecca, which is coming out in March. Yeah. And who is writing about our places? You know, who is writing about Southern California in the way that we deeply know it? Who's writing about Anaheim and Santa Ana? Like, I love Gustavo Arellano's work in the LA Times. I love Steve Lopez's columns in the LA Times. Like, those guys are writing about specific places in Southern California, because everyone judges us and says, oh, how hard can it be? You live in Southern California, there are palm trees. And I always think, do you have any idea how many of my friends and relatives have died when their cars have hit palm trees? Like, this is a thing, isn't it? Like, the altar of the palm tree is how we grew up. And when we were raising our kids, I never forgot. I knew Dwayne would tell them the minute they turned 15 and wanted to drive, he'd say, I'm going to tell you what my dad told me. You have to watch out for them walking palm trees. And like, that's this legend that my girls will tell their kids someday. You're driving at night and the palm trees seem to move. Like, who's writing about our place? Yeah. So it was imperative that I do it. And yeah, so for Mecca, I'm writing about.
If you could tell us a little bit about the book you're working on now. I have some questions from our listeners, but I do want to talk about your new book.
Well, no, I'm happy to take the question. I just was going to say, I'll be really excited to send this link to you when it comes out. This book has major portions set in Anaheim, Santiago Canyon, Santa Ana, Yorba Linda, which I think you might find interesting. It's all set along the 91 freeway, and it's about a Chicano California Highway Patrolman. And it's based on my friend Louis Lozano, who was born in Corona, and all the stories that guys tell me about being CHP officers and like what that means. And it's also set during COVID. So the female characters, there are 5 nurses and 5, one guy's an animal control officer, one guy's a CHP officer, one guy restores classic Chevy Impalas and other cars, and one guy is a butcher for Stater Brothers. So it couldn't be more Southern California. But
are you breathing a sigh of relief going back to fiction after the rigors of nonfiction?
Yeah, I have really loved talking about In the Country of Women for these months because of just what your readers said. It means something to to make sure we preserve our histories and women's stories. But let's get to the questions from the audience. I'm excited.
Hey, one more though, from me. Part of this is set during COVID. Do you think we'll see a series of COVID novels? Not from you, but I mean, this seems to be such a transformative event in our lives, in our history, and it's still playing out. Do you think that there will be great COVID novels?
To be absolutely honest, I think that COVID has shown this great divide, as everyone's pointing out now. My neighborhood is full of people who work at warehouses or who are heating and air conditioning or nurses. So my neighborhood and my family were hit very, very hard by COVID. And I think what's funny is so many writers talk about COVID as a chance to rediscover themselves, but they were able to stay home and order their food from DoorDash. And my neighbors work for DoorDash. And, you know, my next door neighbor, Mario, was in the first 100 people in Riverside County to get COVID on March 15th, and he almost died.
Wow.
And so our whole street, we were all cooking for each other because everyone was sick.
Yeah.
I had COVID in April, and it's fascinating to me. And that was because I was taking care of my parents and I had to keep going out and getting stuff for them. What's fascinating is that my friends are the people who were hit so hard, like nurses and cops. That's what I'm interested in writing about. And it's very, like, my agent she says that she just cries that when she reads the fiction I'm writing about nurses in the ICU. She lives in Brooklyn, and that's a whole different kind of story. So I think that we're going to see so many different kinds of COVID stories, but the ones I'm interested in are all the people who still had to go to work. I have a colleague whose mom worked in a Michael Kors warehouse, and she was just like, who's still buying Michael Kors purses? Like right now, why am I getting COVID so I can pack Michael Kors purses? That line made it into my fiction because it broke my heart. So.
Yeah. No, I'm always amazed at the heroism of just everyday people. You know, it's COVID, you're locked down, you go out once a month, and there's the person at Walmart who's bagging your groceries. They're exponentially braver than I am because they're there every day. And, you know, I'm hiding in my basement while I'm waiting for this thing to blow over. So, and garage mechanics and policemen and nurses. So yes, I'm with you on that. Here's a question from one of our readers. Do you feel Riverside, California represents all of California? Why or why not?
Well, that's the funny thing is when this novel, Mecca, went out to publishers, it was a funny thing to say. I finally said this to people. I never wanted to write the great American novel. I always just want to write the great California novel. This is that'll be my 10th novel. And I feel as if the great California novel is the great American novel. I don't feel that the great American novel can only take place in St. Louis or Chicago or New York. And so I feel like Riverside is just my place in the same way that William Faulkner's place is in Mississippi and Flannery O'Connor's place was in her small town in Georgia. But also Toni Morrison wrote about her birthplace, Lorain, Ohio. That's her fictional medallion. Toni Morrison wrote novel after novel set in this very small place in Ohio. And those are great American novels. So I feel like Riverside is unique in some ways, but like I love Yorba Linda. I love Santa Ana. And this novel's called Mecca because there's portions of it that takes place in the Coachella Valley. Oh my gosh, the Coachella Valley. What a rich place for storytelling. But I also love all the little tiny places. For example, I'm obsessed with Los Nietos. You know, this is a tiny little place, Los Nietos. I'm obsessed with Black Star Canyon in the Santa Ana range. I'm obsessed with one of my former graduate students just moved to Vin Scully Drive down the street from Dodger Stadium. That's a great little neighborhood. So I think all of the places in California are the great American place.
Okay. Do you have a favorite book of the books you've written?
Of the books I've written?
Yes.
No. It's really funny, but it's like asking me if which of my 3 daughters is my favorite. I cannot say that. Whereas my mom was super clear on that. My brother, Jeff, who passed away, that was definitely her favorite. I was definitely not her favorite, as you can see from the memoir. But that doesn't mean I'm not the person who takes care of her every day now. It's just, It's a funny thing. I don't, all the books are so different to me. Blacker Than a Thousand Midnights is about a young Black man who's a firefighter. And that was my chance to write about wildfire. And that book came out in 1994. So you know how long we've been understanding wildfires here, right? But I love High Wire Moon. I started that book when I was 19 and I finished it when I was 34. And that book takes place it's about a woman who crosses the border and meets up with a crazy guy, kind of like my brother. And her daughter is half Oaxacan, Mexican, crazy Californian, and grows up in foster care. And I wanted to write about what it's like to be a child growing up in foster care. And also I wanted to write about our version of Southern California. But no, I like them all.
Okay. One of our readers wants to know, how did you choose the title of your book?
Oh, In the Country of Women? That's a great question. No one ever asked me that question. I'm so impressed. This has been such a fun event. Yeah, no one's ever asked me in all these events why I chose that for a title. It was really hard because I had these 6 women in mind. You know what? I had like my grandmothers, both grandmothers. I had Aunt Jenny, I had Fine, and I had Daisy and Alberta. I had all these women in mind, and I couldn't figure out what to do. And I realized that, you know, the James Agee, the famous Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, I just kept thinking about all these titles that had men in them. And at first the book was called, Daisy, Fine, Ruby, Rose, you know, and that didn't seem right. And I couldn't figure it out. And then all of a sudden, I remember I was standing in front of the refrigerator one day and I was getting ready to cook dinner. And my agent had called me about something else. And I said, you know what? I feel like I'm just in this country of women with people just, I had all these girls at the house that day and my daughters and my cousins. And she said, well, that's a much better title. And I had all these, you know, migrations and all in the country of women. Just, it came to me standing in front of the refrigerator. So it was as if I was lucky enough to realize that that made it a big title, and I liked it.
It's a great title. It's fairly clear what you would want women and more specifically girls to take away from reading your book. But those men and those boys that are lucky enough to read it, what would you like them to take away from In the Country of Women?
Well, one thing that's funny is here's my giant ex-husband and I hanging out. You know, he looks like a slightly shorter Shaquille O'Neal. You can see him in the book. He used to sew and iron, and everyone gave him a hard time because he liked sewing. We took home ec together. We were joking about this the other day. My brother-in-law, General, is obsessed with shoes. I just think men have all these really amazing characteristics that lots of times American masculinity in our generation, Bob, people said, oh no, you can't be, you know, you can't be ironing clothes and be a true man. And so I think what I like is when male readers say to me, I didn't realize how badass, you know, my grandma was, or I didn't realize how badass like my tia was, you know, it's like, I didn't realize how badass this woman who lived next door to me, who was like a nurse who, you know, always like brought food for our family. So I love the fact that in the book, I'm able to talk about Oscar Medina and my father-in-law, General Sims. They created this place, the driveway. And I can sit in the driveway every Friday. You know, we sit in the driveway, even when it's hot, it's 110. We'll sit in the driveway. That is a place that was created by General and Alberta Sims that will always exist. And the men in that driveway are great storytellers too. But as they always point out, it was the women who held our family together. So I really like that men sort of don't mind realizing that now.
Okay, well, our time is almost up. Before we go, there are just 2 things I want. First, I want to remind people In the Country of Women by Susan Straight, available at bookstores everywhere and at your public library. I wanted to read one more quote from one of our learners, and then I will turn it over to you to tell us anything that you would like us to close with. This is from our learner, Lorena, and I think it's a perfect quote, the perfect thing, that the piece of feedback we got based on our conversation today. When I read to my daughter, I read and she understands. That's from Lorena.
I think that's beautiful.
Yeah. So this is Bob Madison with Huntington Beach Public Library Literacy Volunteers. Susan, how would you like to close our conversation today?
Well, I think this is one of the best conversations I've ever had because of you, but also because of those great readers. And Lorena's right. The one other thing I was going to show you all. That when my girls were little, here's my original house at Pooh Corner.
Oh,
right?
wow. With the shepherd illustrations.
It's very beat up. And here's this funny little book that might mean nothing to anyone else, but this was one of the first books that my oldest daughter loved me to read to her over and over again. And so this, just when you hold your child and you're able to read to him or her, again, for someone like my mom, you know, who had such a hard time, and there she was abandoned, and I'm 3 years old and I won't eat my oatmeal, as she still says to me the other day. Well, you didn't want to eat your oatmeal, so I hit you and your oatmeal flew across the room and you said, I'm still not going to eat my oatmeal. To buy me that book for 25 cents and to read Tawny Scrawny Lion to me, there is nothing like reading or singing to your child. You know, it's the sound that you get. And so Lorena's right. When you read to your daughter, the sound comes from here and comes out to here, but your child feels it here. I think we're really lucky to end on Lorena's quote. I think that's really nice.
Well, writers often make our communities better, and certainly writers like Susan Straight make our community better. So I want to thank you on behalf of the Huntington Beach Literacy Volunteers. This being my first broadcast with you, I don't know quite what I must do to this to a close, but I certainly don't want to impinge on you over our hour. So thank you so much for taking this time with us. Thank you for everyone who tuned in and is listening. This will be housed on our website, and recordings, you know, people can watch later on. And again, Susan Straight, congratulations on the book. I hope it continues to be a great success, and that Mecca is even more successful if that is possible. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Happy reading.
Bye-bye. Thank you.